The way to do the president is to start out with Mr. Rogers. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. Then you add a little John Wayne. Here we go. Let's go over the ridge. You put them together. You got George Herbert Walker Bush.
Hi, George Herbert Walker Bush.
In 1989, George Bush became the first sitting vice president to win a presidential election since Martin Van Buren in 1836. Bush helped secure his victory with a bold campaign pledge.
Read my lips. No new taxes. And we've got to hold that line.
What was important at that point in time was to sound decisive. It could have been, read my lips, I will stand up to the Soviet Union, or read my lips, I will shop at Walmart. It really didn't matter. It was decisive.
Number 41, George Herbert Walker Bush, 1989 to 1993, 64 years old, from Texas. George Bush's resume was long and distinguished. He had been a two-term congressman from Texas, a UN ambassador, and was the first president to have been head of the CIA. Bush was a New Englander by birth, but spent much of his adult life in Texas. He was a Yale man known for loyalty to his friends and a competitive streak that carried over from sports into politics.
Oh, get in.
Bush's opponents seized upon his preppy image and characterized him as a wimp.
You know, the wimp factor really isn't fair, because this is a man who is a World War II hero, who got blown out of his airplane, almost died serving his country. George Bush is many things. A wimp is simply not one of them.
With his management style, Bush set out to show that he was more engaged than his predecessor, Ronald Reagan.
Bush drove everybody crazy trying to keep up with him in the White House.
He was basically a very nice guy and very much a centrist in a way. He really liked to govern the country, based on consensus.
Bush's presidency was defined by two major foreign policy events, the end of the Cold War and the Gulf War against Saddam Hussein. In both instances, he displayed his deftness for patient diplomacy. But as the free world cheered the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, President Bush was actually criticized for playing it cool.
You don't seem elated, and I'm wondering if you're thinking of the problem.
I'm just not an emotional kind of guy.
Well, how elated are you?
I'm very pleased.
There was one politician who said that if it was me in the White House, I'd be dancing on top of the Berlin Wall. I'm glad he wasn't. Bush instinctively knew that for bigger and better things, he was going to need Gorbachev's partnership.
The way to do that was not to stick it in their eye when the Berlin Wall came down, but to continue to work with them so the Cold War would end with a whimper and not with a bang, and that's what President Bush did.
The most difficult test of Bush's presidential leadership began in August of 1990, when Iraqi strongman Saddam Hussein invaded neighboring Kuwait.
Unfortunately, Iraq has thus far turned a deaf ear to the voices of peace and reason.
In his public speeches, Bush emphasized the need to respond to the naked aggression of Saddam Hussein, but he had other reasons for taking the country to war.
Look, I've been a member of 4 administrations. In every one of those administrations, we had as a written national security policy that we would go to war to protect the energy reserves of the Persian Gulf, if necessary, to protect access to those energy reserves for the West. Well, it was necessary in 1991, and we did it.
In the months leading up to the Gulf War, George Bush worked the phones, enlisting the support of the United Nations and building an international coalition of 34 countries to eject Saddam from Kuwait.
I think that the elder George Bush was the best foreign policy president we've had in my lifetime. He realized it would be wrong and counterproductive for America to try to do the invasion and be responsible for its aftermath without the support not only of our European allies, but of Arab nations in the region. And it was that type of foreign policy, that ability to be an internationalist and to care about other nations and allies, that really set the elder George Bush apart.
We are not here on some exercise. This is a real-world situation. And we're not walking away until our mission is done, until the invader is out of Kuwait.
After 5.5 weeks of aerial bombardment, the ground war began. Within hours, the Iraqi army was in full retreat from Kuwait, and soldiers were surrendering en masse. Bush now had an opportunity to send troops into Baghdad to topple Saddam's regime, but instead he declared it was mission accomplished. Leaving Saddam in power was a controversial decision, but one about which Bush had no doubts.
Taking Saddam out of power was never one of George Bush's stated war aims. The stated war aim was getting him out of Kuwait.
We tried to get him, of course, during the war, because he was the leader of the Iraqi armed forces. That would have been perfectly legitimate. To get him after the war, we would have had to occupy Iraq, go all the way to Baghdad, and we see today that was not a particularly attractive choice.
After the war, Bush's approval rating soared to 84%. Re-election in 1992 seemed likely. But the deficit spawned by the Reagan years had forced the president to renege on his famous campaign pledge and agree to raise taxes.
Bush betrayed our trust. He raised our taxes.
It may have cost him the election, but it was probably good for the country.
I think one of the great things George Bush did is to go back on that pledge and to make the compromises necessary with the Democratic leadership on Capitol Hill to get us a little bit closer to the path of a balanced budget. That worked, and that helped set the stage for the great economic growth of the 1990s.
Unseated by the charismatic Bill Clinton, President Bush left behind a legacy of political moderation. In the end, he proved to be an able, behind-the-scenes operator and skilled diplomat, but an inadequate salesman of his ideas and policies. In 1974, George Bush, as chairman of the Republican National Committee, formally asked Richard Nixon to resign.
They have had the White House so long that they've run out of energy, run out of ideas, run out of direction, and they ought to be run out of town, and with your help we can.
Bill Clinton was the first rock and roll president. The saxophone-playing governor from Arkansas had run a youthful campaign. He revealed on MTV what type of underwear he favored while outrunning whispered allegations of extramarital affairs.
I was Bill Clinton's lover for 12 years.
There is a school of thought that Bill Clinton really wanted to be a rock star, but he'd settle for being president of the States if he could live like a rock star.
Number 42, Bill Clinton, Democrat, 1993 to 2001, 46 years old, from Arkansas. Bill Clinton's election fulfilled a lifelong ambition for a poor kid from the wrong side of the tracks who was determined to become president. As a politician, he was a natural.
Clinton was the most seductive and charming person I've ever seen in national politics. He could be in a room of 100 people and make each person he talked to feel like he was directly boring into that person's soul.
He's famous for his handshake. It's not just a handshake. He grabs your hand and then his other hand moves up your arm, and pretty soon he's enfolded you in a giant embrace. He was just kind of all-embracing bear of a man.
Clinton was a Yale Law School graduate and a Rhodes Scholar. His empathy, captured in the catchphrase, "I feel your pain," was legendary. So was his appetite for junk food.
How is that?
I haven't eaten it yet. I'm eating the apple fritter right now.
Bill Clinton's management style was chaotic. His White House was known for casual dress, crowded meetings, and all-night bull sessions.
He is so interested in different viewpoints that he could have 60 people in a room and be willing to listen to every one of them because he might just find a different clue as to something he hadn't thought about.
One viewpoint Clinton clearly valued was his first ladies. Hillary Clinton was the first presidential spouse to have an office in the West Wing, and to some members of the staff it seemed like there were two presidents.
You could take an issue to the president, and if he said no, you could appeal to the First Lady, and maybe she would say yes, and then maybe you could get her to get him to change his mind.
Neither are those people.
Clinton's first 2 years in office saw the failure of the administration's health care reform initiative and the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement. Thanks in part to the vehemence of Clinton's political enemies, the young presidency was already being defined by the types of investigations and scandals that would eventually consume it. Travelgate, Whitewater, and the filing of a sexual harassment lawsuit against the president by Paula Jones. In the 1994 midterm elections, a resurgent Republican Party gained control of both houses of Congress for the first time in 40 years.
He was clearly depressed by the loss that had taken place.
Everybody figured he was finished. They underestimated what a good politician Bill Clinton is.
Clinton made a move towards the political center, using public opinion polls as his guidepost. But he was challenged at every step by his newly minted nemesis, Republican Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich.
In some ways, Newt Gingrich was a great gift to Bill Clinton, much as the malefactors of great wealth were to Teddy Roosevelt, or Douglas MacArthur was to Harry Truman.
It was in the budget negotiations late in 1995 that the battle between Clinton and Gingrich came to a head. With the threat of a government shutdown looming, Gingrich tried to force Clinton into making concessions on Medicare and education spending. But the president refused to compromise.
At that point, I said to myself, the president gets it, because in politics you really do have to draw a line. And at that point, he understood that he had to draw a line. And I think it was a turning point in the presidency.
Clinton's risk paid off. He was able to paint Gingrich and the Republicans as the cause of the government shutdown, forcing them to an eventual budget compromise. It was a great political victory. But during the shutdown, most of the paid White House staff was sent home, which allowed an unpaid intern named Monica Lewinsky to get unusually close to the president. With his convincing re-election in 1996, Clinton's political comeback was complete. Taking advantage of the booming American economy, he was now able to steer Congress to balance the federal budget for the first time since Andrew Jackson's presidency. Then the bubble burst. In August 1998, Clinton's Oval Office affair with Monica Lewinsky became public when the former intern was called to testify in the Paula Jones sexual harassment case.
That was the beginning of Lewinsky Gate and the scandal that just totally consumed Bill Clinton's presidency.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
When you make a mistake, you got to fess up and do it fast. If he had said, I made a mistake with this young woman, I'm sorry, it would have been controversial, been hard. But I think the country would have rallied to him and we could have been spared the impeachment process.
Instead, on December 19, 1998, Bill Clinton became only the second president in history to be impeached. As had happened with Andrew Johnson 130 years earlier, the momentum of the impeachment process sputtered when it came time to vote him out of office. Neither the American public nor the United States Senate found Clinton's lying about his sex life to be an adequate reason for his removal.
I think 100 years from now, historians are still going to be scratching their heads on the question of the impeachment of Bill Clinton. Was it an impeachable offense? Well, it was impeachable only because it was caught up in this strange and bitter politics that really defined the 1990s.
It was a dangerous sideshow because while we were all concentrating on Bill Clinton's sexual peccadillos, Osama bin Laden in the mountains of Afghanistan was preparing a plot that was going to kill 3,000 Americans.
Having survived impeachment, Clinton did what he could to salvage the remainder of his presidency. He lent American military might to a NATO effort that halted an ethnic cleansing campaign in Kosovo. And he made a bold but unsuccessful effort to revive the faltering peace process between Israel and the Palestinians. By the time he left office, Bill Clinton had presided over the longest economic expansion in American history, yet his legacy will always be clouded by his impeachment.
You're not going to have kids queuing up in Little Rock at his presidential library to see the NAFTA pen under glass. People look for drama in history, and the great drama of the Clinton years, unfortunately, was his impeachment problem and the Lewinsky scandal, and that's what he has to live with.
During the 1994 baseball strike, President Bill Clinton ordered representatives of the players and owners to meet and resolve the strike. Both sides ignored the presidential order. The 2000 election between Al Gore and George W. Bush seemed like it would never end. Gore won the popular vote, but neither candidate could claim victory in the Electoral College until it was determined who rightfully won the close race in Florida. Simply put, whoever won the state's 25 disputed electoral votes would win the presidency. What followed was a circus of recounts and court cases. The affair was settled more than a month after Election Day with a seemingly partisan 5-4 Supreme Court decision that halted the recounts and handed the election to Bush. For the son of the 41st president, it was time to unify the country.
I think the expectation, at least in the press, was that because Bush had won so narrowly, he would be a fairly moderate figure. People like me who guessed that guessed wrong.
Number 43, George W. Bush, Republican, first elected in 2000, 53 years old, from Texas. When he was elected, George W. Bush joined John Quincy Adams as the only presidential son to win the White House. The younger George Bush was more conservative than his father, but shared some similarities in his worldview.
Both Bushes see the world in good guy, bad guy mentality. Both Bushes see Saddam Hussein as evil. Both Bushes see the forces of the United States as the good force. And both Bushes have taken policy steps to ensure that good would triumph over evil. It's a part of their makeup.
George W. Bush was a former prep school cheerleader who embraced the cowboy ethic of his Texas home. As a leader, he sometimes came across as the national sheriff.
And so long as I'm the president of this country, we're going to chase them down one by one to make sure the American homeland is secure.
A graduate of Yale and Harvard Business School and the former governor of Texas, Bush nevertheless portrayed himself as an outsider who disdained the elites. His inarticulate speaking style led many to question his intelligence.
A report came out of the atomic, the IAEA, that they were 6 months away from developing a weapon.
His intelligence is an emotional intelligence. He can look at people, he can size them up pretty quickly, he can get to the heart of what they're like, and tend to know how to judge them. That's a pretty useful attribute in a politician and a useful one in the president. It would be nice if it were combined with some depth of reflection and some nuance and some curiosity, and intellectual curiosity and rigor about the issues.
Despite his lack of curiosity for the details, Bush is one of the most decisive presidents in history, and he runs a tight ship.
In the Clinton White House, everything ran late, including the president. In the Bush White House, everything is on time and is considered to be rude and unacceptable if you're late for a meeting. You come dressed in your suit, you make it brief, you salute the commander-in-chief, and then you go. It's a very rigorous, orderly process.
Bush may very well have enjoyed a leisurely presidency if not for the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended.
This president's had 2 inaugurations. I mean, he had a formal constitutional inauguration, and then 3 days after September 11th, he had his real inauguration.
And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon. Whether we bring our enemies to justice or bring justice to our enemies, justice will be done.
What Bush was really code wording to the American people is revenge. We're going to get who did this to us.
With the overwhelming support of the American public, Bush launched a military campaign that rid Afghanistan of the terrorist-harboring Taliban government. At the same time, he centralized domestic security under a new federal bureaucracy, the Department of Homeland Security.
He came to Washington, sworn to making government less central to our lives. And yet, because of events that no one could have foreseen, he has presided over, arguably, the greatest centralization of authority in Washington, perhaps since Lyndon Johnson.
In his 2002 State of the Union address, Bush seemed to widen the scope of his war on terror to include regimes in North Korea, Iran, and Iraq.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
We know now that this expression, the axis of evil, grew partly as cover. Bush wanted to signal that he wanted to go after Iraq, but he didn't want to be too obvious about it.
After a failed attempt to win international support for overthrowing Saddam Hussein, Bush used his new doctrine of preemption to launch a unilateral war in Iraq.
I think Bush made the decision to invade Iraq far too early. He tried to tie it in with the global spread of terrorism, and the ties were very tenuous. He had a group of advisors around him, and certain things in his own mind and heart that said that Iraq was the next place we had to fight.
In 2004, George W. Bush avoided the fate of his father when he was re-elected to a second term. It's still too soon for historians to assess his presidency.
We do know this, though, that it is an important presidency. And that's more than we know about many presidencies.
The walls of the White House bear witness to the storied history of the American presidency. Men from all parts of the country and all walks of life each took on the office with high hopes and pledged to lead the country to the best of his ability.